Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And our guest today is the Premier, we'll explain why he's not a Prime Minister, the Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas, who kindly introduced Rory and me to the stage when we did an event at the Adelaide Festival last year, me in person, Rory down the line. And that was where I first got to know Peter, this former trade union leader who has made a pretty big mark on Australian politics already in 2 years as Premier. And Rory and I were both struck by two things in particular that he's currently trying to do: ban all political donations to try to get money out of politics, and ban social media use by young people. He's also an important player in AUKUS, the tripartite defence arrangement with the US and the UK, and like most Aussie politicians, follows UK politics very closely. And given a career spent trying to improve rights for Australia's Indigenous communities, I suspect he was as sad as we were at the defeat of the Voice referendum. In fact, a lot sadder, because he really is something very, very close to home and very close to his heart. So we've got so much to talk about. We're very grateful to you, Peter, for being there. Rory, where do you want to start?
Well, Peter, let's try to start with who you are, roughly, where you come from, where your family came from. Just give us a sense of family background and childhood.
Oh, thanks for having us on. Rory, so Malinauskas is Lithuanian. Most people in Australia think I'm Greek. Even my wife thought I was Greek until we were well into our relationship. But my mum's side's all Irish Catholic. But my paternal grandfather was Lithuanian. He came to Australia in 1948 as a refugee or a displaced person, fleeing the communists that were invading Lithuania. And my grandmother was doing a similar thing coming from Hungary. And they met in Australia as displaced people and met at the immigration camp and fell in love and then lived out what is a pretty common story in Australia, where they worked their guts out and did everything to give my father opportunity. And I guess I feel very much the beneficiary of Australia's generosity at the time to my grandparents, and that undoubtedly has informed my sort of worldview growing up.
Do you feel European at all?
That's a good question. Look, I have a great interest in my family's heritage, but, you know, the Baltic community, when they came to Australia, they sort of embraced Australian life pretty quickly. And because they were so small, they haven't probably had that intergenerational passing on of cultures in a way we've seen in other multicultural communities in Australia. So tragically, I know too little about Lithuanian or Hungarian culture. And so I guess I would struggle to identify in any way as European. My whole consciousness as a young person growing up was very much in the Australian culture as Brits would understand it.
Peter, give us a sense of the type of Australia you grew up in: rural, urban, small house, big house, what your dad was doing. You know, what was your childhood like? And can you think of sort of comparisons with things that international listeners might be able to relate to understand this kind of life?
Do you know, it's interesting, Roy. I grew up very fortunate in a sort of pretty standard middle-class suburban household in suburban Adelaide. My dad was a public servant working for the Public Housing Trust, you know, the Public Housing Authority in South Australia, and my mother was a librarian for the local newspaper. And so, you would describe them as high-income earners, and I guess, but it was a pretty traditional house in suburban Adelaide. I would say it was a highly engaged household in terms of current affairs, but never robustly political. They weren't members of political parties. They were swinging voters. The Lithuanian background was my grandmother's background was vehemently anti-communist. So in many respects, they would be, my grandfather was certainly rolling over his grave that I joined the Labor Party, let alone and now leading it in my state. So there was always an impetus to be engaged with democracy, but never into politics per se. So on one level, it makes sense that I'm doing what I am doing now, but also that would have been unthought of as a kid growing up.
Do you think they would not be turning in the grave at the fact that, like Rory Stewart, you're on Vladimir Putin's banned from coming here list? You must be reasonably proud of that.
I'll tell you what, that happened pretty quickly after I got elected Premier, and I said a few things and moved some legislation in our parliament compelling the state to divest some superannuation assets that we had in Russian products. So once he did that, I was quietly chuffed about it. And so were a lot of the other local Lithuanians in our state who probably are more conservative voters.
And do you think that you were picked on purely because you do have this Lithuanian background?
There's no doubt in my mind. No doubt in my mind. And I had the chance to meet the Lithuanian president when he was in Australia recently, and we discussed this, and that was certainly their view, and they were well versed in it, which I was quite surprised by.
Peter, then tell us a little bit about what happened next then. So you went through school, and you then, what was your first job? What was the path that eventually led you to become Premier?
So the biggest supermarket chain in Australia is Walz. And, as a kid, I started wanting to do things, and Mum and Dad said, sure, no worries, you got to go get a job. So I got a job at the supermarket, and, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a great experience. And I was there for like 7 or 8 years while I was going through university. But
what were you doing? What was the job?
So I started out pushing trolleys, and then graduated to the checkout before doing night field. And I guess what happened was there was a few, I was a member of the union, the Shop Assistants Union, not because I was a unionist, just because everyone joined the union. And they ran a few campaigns, and one of them got my attention. And I sort of volunteered to get the petitions in the store, get the signatures of other workers in the store. And that drew attention to me as a young person. And then, I had a fateful interaction with the then union secretary one day, and we got talking, and he offered me a job, and Mum and Dad were horrified at the prospect of it. But long story short, I decided that I'd work 10 hours a week for the union visiting night field workers. And within a month of working there, I realised I'd found my natural political home, because not too dissimilarly into the UK, the Shop Assistants Union was a moderate union. It was associated with the right of the Labor Party. It believed in markets. It believed in capital getting a return, but just simply thought that workers should have professional representation. And that accorded with the worldview that I was forming while I was at university. And from there, one thing led to the other. And I've been very grateful for some great stewardship and support that I've had from a few leaders in the movement.
I get the sense that the trade unions in Australia are still a much bigger part of national life than maybe they have been in recent years in the UK. Is that your sense?
Arguably, yes. I think the trade union movement globally we've seen it's been in decline in terms of membership, and that's particularly true for private sector unions. And I don't think that's a coincidence in terms of the fact that it's lined up with the very same time we've seen global economic and income inequality on the rise. The moment the trade union membership globally declined, income inequality started going up. So that has sort of made the trade union more relevant, but we haven't seen it transpire to a massive increase in membership, which continues to be a struggle, I think, in most Western democracies.
One of the things that in my work in international development that's been very striking is that the fading of the trade unions has actually been a very sad impact on international development, because the trade unions, along with, in fact, churches, were very important in the move to make poverty history and drive international solidarity and development. I mean, is that something that you've seen in Australia and in your lifetime as well?
I think it's part of that phenomenon we see, throughout the West, a decline in institutions, declines in people joining membership-based organisations, whether it requires filling out a form or not. And that in turn has undermined, I think, a sense of social equity or a sense of, frankly, social justice in some elements. But I don't judge the society for that. I think, individuals are leading increasingly busy lives, but I think that impost of being busier to just, maintain a decent standard of living rather than get ahead has in fact been a function of the fact that we've seen a decline of the very institutions that have been fundamental to advancing the cause of people being able to have a decent standard of living.
So what was it about being a trade unionist, a trade union leader, that then made you think, do you know what, maybe I need to get into politics itself and become a politician?
But going from the trade union movement into the political arm of the Labor, in terms of the Labor Party in Australia is a pretty well-trodden path. But
yeah,
the truth is that, we were able to engage on a range of issues. We were the largest union in the country at the time, and I got a taste for the power of parliaments and governments to be able to make a more substantial change in the lives of working people, but, have a positive impact on society more broadly. One of the things we did in South Australia during that time was, I campaigned and led a charge to make Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve a part-day public holiday, which sounds like a small thing, but let me tell you, it's not to a worker who might have a chance of being with their family on Christmas Eve that otherwise didn't have that opportunity. So, and I just found that whole experience exhilarating to see, a piece of legislation pass the Parliament. And once you get a taste for it, it's an absolute thrill in terms of, having such a, what I believe is a positive impact. So, but I can't point, Alastair, to a singular moment in time. But I would say is that, there is something utterly satisfying and exhilarating about getting something done in a political landscape that's contested.
Was there ever a single moment in time where you thought, once you got into politics, where you thought, I reckon I could be a leader of this thing. I could become state premier. I could, go pretty far.
There's a saying that, familiarity breeds contempt. I think, don't misinterpret that. I think that once you sort of establish that you can make a contribution and get a degree of confidence that, you do have the capacity to lead, one thing can lead to another pretty quickly. But I took over as leader of the party just after we lost an election, after a period of 16 years in government, and no one really gave much of a chance to returning to government. But thankfully, we were able to achieve that. And I thought, having had 2 years' experience as a minister before becoming leader of the opposition, I desperately wanted to get that opportunity again. And I relished the chance to be able to make even a bigger difference than I was able to in that 2 years. And I'm now blessed with that opportunity and just don't want to waste a moment.
Tell us a little bit about the other paths that people took to become politicians, your contemporaries. So you took a route where you spent nearly 12 years working as a professional trade union person. And you came in, I guess, when in your mid-30s, you were sort of 35 when you came into Parliament. Give us a sense of 3 or 4 other typical routes that Australian politicians take when you look around the other people, either in your part of Australia or indeed at the federal level. What are the typical routes people take? 3 or 4 of them.
I would say that one of the most typical is we see people coming out of professional services. Think of a lawyer who's, not too dissimilar to what Keir Starmer's path to, a significant role in the British Labor Party. Professional services, a lawyer typically will enter into public life because they're a sense of devotion, a sense of civic duty, and they see Parliament and public life as a path. I would say the other one, you do see representations of people from social services, teachers aren't uncommon in our parliaments in Australia. I would say, trade unionists, teachers and lawyers arguably are overrepresented. On the conservative side of politics, we still do see some pretty good examples of people coming from a traditional small business advocacy route. And there are examples of people with those backgrounds making a pretty big contribution on the conservative side of politics. And I'm trying to make sure we attract those types of people to the Labor Party in South Australia as well, because I think there's a small business constituency that social democratic parties haven't been thinking enough about.
And Peter, you have this federal structure. So you've got the states, small number of states. At the moment, all Labor, yeah?
All bar one.
Which is the one? Tasmania?
Tasmania.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've got all states, bar one, Tasmania, which are Labor run. They're all Labor premiers at the moment. And you've got a Labor Prime Minister, Albanese, at the federal level. How does that relationship work? And is there a kind of downside to having a Labor government in Canberra, as well as the obvious upside?
Look, the upside speaks for itself. I mean, there's a congeniality when you start at a decision-making forum with people having a similar worldview. I guess the rubber hits the road when you've got a responsibility to advocate your own constituency's interests against what might be the political interests of the federal government. And we've certainly seen examples of that. And I sort of certainly see that as a test for me personally, because, I've got a sense of loyalty to the Labor Party and the Labor movement, clearly, but that's not what my principal obligation is to. I've got a duty to my state more broadly that supersedes any party loyalties. And that test is always challenging, but I can recall at least a couple of examples recently where I've had to speak out against federal government policy, including today. That creates an occasional moment of awkwardness. But
what's the thing today?
The federal government's looking at cutting back the number of international students coming into Australia because
immigration.
Yeah. And you'd be well familiar with the policies of immigration. But I'm very worried about what that policy means for our country. And I think there's a higher road that we can take. And I've said as much today, and the phone's rung accordingly.
Has any of the phone calls come from somebody called AA?
The Prime Minister and I get on exceedingly well, and I'm going to hopefully see him on the weekend. And so no is the short answer to your question, but I think the political architecture know my worldview about these matters, and the importance of investing in education. And international students bring a lot of revenue to our education system, for better or worse. And I don't think anyone would be surprised by my remarks today.
Peter, the two systems, I guess, that many of our listeners will be most familiar with are the British and the US system. Can you provide us a brief summary of what's different, the Australian system compared to the UK and the US when it comes to the way that federal state government's organised?
Well, Australia is really, via design, a blend of the two systems. In terms of the role of states and its interaction with the Commonwealth government or the federal government, the federal government is modelled on the US system, a Senate and a House of Representatives, the Senate being the representative of states and the House of Representatives reflecting the House of Commons in the UK, albeit with a Westminster system. So we are directly a blend of the two. And, premiers' roles equates with governors in the United States. It's just that we, as a smaller country, have a lot fewer of them. There is undoubtedly greater similarity and affinity to the Westminster system in the UK, but it is just got some nuances that make us far similar to the US.
And Peter, we're interviewing you just a day after the announcement that Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, is going to be running as the vice presidential candidate with Kamala Harris. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that. It strikes me that maybe being governor of Minnesota is a little bit like being a premier. And I wonder whether, looking at him, looking at you, he's like a straightforward guy who was the football coach in his local town who's now become a major figure. Do you see what Kamala Harris was doing? Are you interested by the choice of somebody like the governor of Minnesota as a running mate?
Absolutely fascinated and enthralled by it. And I don't mind saying I was really excited at the news, and seeing some of the contributions the governor has made on the national stage just in the last 24 hours. I've loved every second of it. This is a Democrat who speaks to, I guess, my politics in many respects. And there is I think he is a great contrast to Kamala Harris and, the governor of Minnesota and, her role in California. That clearly got very different backgrounds. And I'm really excited by his choice. His very plain speaking style, that knockabout dad, clearly culturally feels like he sits pretty comfortably in middle-class America. And that just resonates. And I think it just creates a perfect complement for the Harris campaign. And I've got to say, today's probably the most energised I've been about the Harris campaign, in fact, the Democratic presidential campaign, in 4 years.
You obviously don't feel the same pressure maybe that a federal prime minister or a UK prime minister might feel to, quote, stay out of the American campaign, because I think we could very clearly see where your heart lies in this. What I love about what's happened in the last few weeks with Vice President Harris and now Tim Walz is that it's just brought this, he used the word himself, it's brought this sense of joy back, which is what I think you're expressing. But also, it's perfectly clear to me, Donald Trump and Vance don't know how to deal with it. And I just wanted to ask you in the Australian context, because Australian politics has got a reputation for being really tough. And I love that toughness. I've seen some of that toughness. Paul Keating is one of my heroes, and I know that he's one of yours. But this is going to be a bridge to the sort of donations money, because the donations issue, because I feel the same joy at what's going on right now, but at the same time, the money that they're now involved in raising to try to fight this campaign, the fact that when Kamala Harris was announced, she raised more in a single day than the cost of the entire UK election that we've just had. So how does that joy fit with the fact that you're this sort of sole voice in world politics who's trying to ban all political donations?
It doesn't sit with me very well at all. And I've got to say, I've been appalled by the whole spectre of the thing. I mean, during the course of Biden's the last days of his presidential campaign, we saw a chorus of donors coming out saying that the president has to give up on his candidacy. And it was almost seen as a litmus test or a measuring stick of his legitimacy of being a candidate. And it struck me, I thought, when is it? At what point in, politics did donors start becoming a chief architect of who leads a political party or not?
Yeah.
And then, of course, when Harris became the presumptive nominee and there was an explosion in fundraising, that was then waved around as a demonstration of the success of her candidacy. So it was almost as though that money has superseded any analysis of policy weight in US politics. Raising money is a sign of success. Now, look, on a practical level, it's rational. But on another level, it seems almost perverse that the determinant of success is almost exclusively money, to the extent that donors are now seen as being a principal decision maker of who the candidate for the presidency of the United States is. It struck me as quite contrary to the best traditions of what we understand liberal democracy looks like.
Yeah. And I mean, Peter, as somebody who was an MP and then latterly when I was running for leadership and Mayor of London was trying to raise significant sums of money, it's clear to me that most donors don't give money for nothing. They give money because they have an interest. I mean, you may find a few friends and relatives who may be prepared to write you a check because they like Peter or they like Rory, but often you're raising money from strangers. And I was very struck that means that they also get to determine the issues. One of the first questions I would be asked is, what was my position on Israel-Palestine? And I'm thinking, whoa, hold a second. I'm running to try to sort out the signaling on the Piccadilly line, right? Tell us a little bit about your sense of the way in which actually, donors' interests and the way they try to affect policies, and why that might also be a reason to reform things.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Look, I think I've never seen any, and I've been to a lot of party fundraising. I've had to engage in a lot of fundraising myself. In fact, we're still doing it. And we will continue to do it until such a time we've banned it, and we've got a plan to do that, because I just can't, as part of, the functioning of a political party. I've never seen evidence of politicians of either side being transactional about changing a position on the back of a donation. I've never seen that occur. But what you do see, of course, is political donors more inclined to support candidates and parties that support what they want, and again, on one level, that's quite rational. My frustration is more, though, not so much on the influence that donors have, but on the perception of that influence, which I think undermines people's confidence in the democratic process. But then second to that, but probably just as important, is the amount of time this is now taking of candidates and political leaders. And the genesis of my view that we've just got to get rid of this altogether actually happened in the 2014 US midterms. I was in the US on a political trip, and we got to meet with candidates and campaign managers of both persuasions. And the rule of thumb in the US now for the highest quality campaign managers is they will not work for candidates unless that candidate signs up to spending no less than 80% of their time fundraising. 80%. That is a standard for the best campaign managers. So that means that's not time, speaking to constituents, developing policy, having town hall meetings, meeting stakeholders, none of those things. It's just being a telemarketer fundraising. And, that seems to me to be in the extreme that it fundamentally compromises the electoral process.
And Peter, I think that's right. I was interviewing a congresswoman from Connecticut who said during her time in office, she reckoned she had spent an average of 4 hours every day just on the phone raising money, including weekends.
Yep.
But that also connects to a broader issue that's true in all our politics, which is the way in which campaigning to win office absorbs all the time which would otherwise go into thinking about what to do when you're there. So our classic example, I suppose, is people like Liz Truss, who really saw politics about winning power, but had very little patience for detailed conversations about policy. And she was very successful because that's part of our culture. I mean, it's amazing in Westminster, and I think actually even in Australia and the US, that if you try to have very earnest conversations about policy, you're seen as a bit geeky, that so much of the effort is about, attacking the opposition, winning those votes, getting the opinion polls right, getting the focus groups right, getting the press releases into the newspapers. And that leaves surprisingly little bandwidth for sitting down and really thinking hard about what to do compared, for example, to running a business.
Well, I think that's right. But, history tells us that people who aspire to high office and achieve it without much of a plan of what to do with it once they get it tend to get found out.
Well, Liz Truss did.
Yeah, they tend to get found out. And I mean, from my perspective, in an Australian context, we see at a state level 4-year terms. We have 4-year terms, but at the federal level, it's 3-year terms. Of course, in the House of Reps in the US, it's 2-year terms. So it's hardly surprising that once you cover off on the politics and the fundraising, policy sometimes can come third. I think in the UK, or certainly where you see 4-year terms or 5-year terms.
Up to five, yeah.
5, yeah. I mean, at the very least, if you've got confidence in your leadership, that does render oppositions in particular time to think and curate policy. I hated every moment of opposition except for one thing. I found myself being able to read again. When you're in government, and we're back in the thick of it now, or when you're reading, it's a brief or, it's a note on everything that you should know about running of the government. You're dealing with files. But in opposition, all of a sudden that disappears overnight. But that affords you the ability to read things and think. And I found that really profoundly useful. Particularly in the depths of COVID when I was opposition leader, I read a book about the Attlee government, and that really changed my thinking about the agenda we were going to pursue post-COVID in South Australia if we were lucky enough to form government.
Which book was it, Peter? Do you remember?
Citizen Clem.
Oh,
by John Bew.
Yeah. And not for reading that book, I don't know if I suspect there would have been things that we would have done differently in a policy sense.
That really fascinates me. So there's Clement Attlee, Labour Prime Minister after the war, and Paul Bew, kind of fairly right-wing historian, I think it's fair to say. Is that right, Rory? That's okay?
It's Paul's son, John, I think. But yeah, he then became part of the Boris Johnson's national security apparatus. That's right, yeah.
Becomes an advisor to Boris Johnson. And a book he's written about a Labour Prime Minister is taken up by a Labour Premier in South Australia who says it makes him think about the job differently and do things differently. Can you think of a specific? Well,
of course, during the war period, Attlee was very keen to work collaboratively with Churchill in the war cabinet. No one really gave Attlee much of a chance of winning that election at the conclusion of World War II. But of course, what Attlee did was apply thought, beyond the bipartisan approach to the war effort. He was thinking about reconstruction. And here in Australia, in the middle of COVID, there was no appetite in our domestic politics, quite rightly, for partisanship. There were other I was the only opposition leader at a state level that survived COVID because other opposition leaders were chipping away at their government's responses to COVID. We took an approach that said, look, we're going to provide essentially total bipartisan support for the Conservative government in South Australia on their approach to COVID, because they handled it on the basis of science and did a pretty good job. And then having done that, then we devoted our effort to thinking about, but at the end of COVID, people are going to want to know what's the legacy of COVID going to be. And so, that was the same thing that Attlee did, and of course led to the creation of the NHS. And we had similar policies about how we were going to reinvest in the health system and try and build it back up again.
Yeah.
Peter, so you did something very interesting there, which is not common in British politics, which is to say about your opposition, well, they did it on the basis of science, and I think they did a pretty good job. Generally in British politics, we're very tribal. And even if we secretly think that the other party might have done an okay job on something, we never begin to give them credit for anything.
Yeah.
For fear, I guess. Alastair, why is it we never give them credit for anything? Is it we're worried that a newspaper might pick up and quote us saying something remotely nice about the other party? I've never heard the Labour ever say anything complimentary about 13 or 14 years of Tories in office, and I've never heard the Tories say anything complimentary about 13 years of Labour in office. Why don't we do that in Britain?
Look, you're right, it is not done a lot. I don't think it's not done at all. I think that one of the reasons that the Northern Ireland peace process worked is that from the word go, Tony Blair gave credit to John Major for what he tried to do. John Major gave Tony Blair total support through the whole thing. I think during COVID, it was interesting listening to you, Peter, say that about your approach, because I think Keir Starmer tried to make that his approach in relation to COVID, but with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, it became impossible. But I also think, Rory, that if you look at some of the debates that they've been recently, and we talked on the podcast about how Rishi Sunak actually is now taking a very different tone. I think it's sometimes that the tribalism, the forced tribalism, comes from that sort of Westminster parliamentary system, exacerbated by the way that our media operates. Well, Peter, what's your take on our politics right now?
In the UK or
yeah, when you look at what's going on in the UK right now, what do you think?
Oh, look, there's been a change of government, and that always presents, that is the greatest moment in time, I imagine, for any new leader. Even now, I think back to that window of 6 months post being elected, and knowing what I know now, I ask myself, would I do things differently? The new Prime Minister is enjoying that. Obviously, he's got some challenges on his hands with the events there in the last 48 hours. But just in terms of supporting the government of the day or being generous to your opponents, I actually think that generates a degree of credibility within the electorate. When they hear the opposition leader every single day smashing the government, after a while it's just dog barks. It's fulfilling people's expectations. But if every now and then you are being generous to your opposition, it creates an environment of giving more weight to when you are being critical, particularly depending on how you characterise your criticism as well. So I do wonder, though, whether or not compulsory voting changes the equation there, because part of the challenge in a non-compulsory voting environment, particularly where turnout's declining, as we see in the US and the UK, particularly the last election, you've got to motivate your base. You've got to make them angry. You've got to fire them up and get them out to vote. I never have to worry about that. No Australian politician has to worry about that. Everyone's going to vote. So the task is to persuade people who have voted Conservative at the last election to choose to vote Labor at this election, and vice versa for the Liberal Party.
On compulsory voting, Peter, you're speaking to the absolute converted here.
We're both massive converts, but obviously every time we speak in favour of it, I get challenged with enormous numbers of emails and Twitter attacks.
Yeah.
So the two normal challenges that people make are it's somehow an imposition on civil liberties, it's the government imposing. And the second one that I get quite a lot on Twitter is, come on, Rory, have you ever met a voter? What do you mean you're going to force everybody to vote?
Yeah.
So addressing my kind of skeptical friends or adversaries in Britain who are against compulsory voting, try to make the case for it and explain why it's not as bad as people in Britain fear.
Well, in both the US and the UK, there is an imposition from government on people every single day in most elements of their lives. And so I think the best example is, if the government has the power to compel you to pay tax, why shouldn't they have the ability to compel you to have a say on how those taxes are spent? and that's the. I had a ding dong argument with an American in a pub one day, and that was he had an answer to every argument I had, except that one. So I'm going to stick with it.
Yeah, just to close off on the donations before we move on to social media, you've sort of told us why you want to do it. I'm interested in how you're going to do it, because it strikes me as a very difficult challenge. And I mentioned Paul Keating. I read some of the stuff that Paul has been saying about it. He's very, very opposed to this, and there are opponents.
Yeah.
Rory and I, by the way, are completely with you on it. We think this is a great thing, and it's why we wanted to have you on the podcast, so as that lots of British politicians could maybe hear some of your arguments. But how are you going to do it, and where's the opposition coming from?
Okay, so look, we'll wait and see about the opposition, where the opposition is coming from. I took this policy to the election, and there was not much love for it, even on my own side of politics, I've got to say, internally, for a range of reasons. But I announced it before the election, honestly, because I knew that if we were successful in the election, day one, there becomes a disincentive to do this, because fundraising is a lot easier for incumbents than it is for oppositions. That's the truth of it. Unless the government of the day is in its dying days.
Yeah.
And the writing's on the wall. And the simple reason for that is, if I'm speaking if you're buying a ticket to a fundraiser, you're far more if you're a business, you're more interested to hear what the Premier or the Prime Minister is going to do versus what the opposition might like to do one day if they get the chance. Those things have different weight. The way we're doing it is, firstly, is that we're capping expenditure. We're putting a hard ceiling on the amount that can be spent by political parties and individual candidates in seats. So a hard cap on the amount that can be expended. Something that we've actually already got in South Australia. We're just going to lower that cap a little bit. But then the second thing that we're doing is that we're going to publicly fund up to that cap. So it's a dual measure, a cap, and then publicly fund up to the cap. Now, there are complexities with this, because it is diabolically complex for a range of reasons, including the High Court has been rather restrictive in this. But we've developed a few models that we think can navigate through that path, including, importantly, the preservation of the interests of independents, crossbench, smaller, and also new entrants to the political system. They've got to have an ability to participate as well.
Yeah,
Peter, talk me through that, because I've run as an independent, and it's brutally tough to run against the main parties. So imagine I was running in one of the constituencies in your state. How would I qualify to actually get the money to allow me to run against the Labor candidate if I'm an independent who's come from nowhere?
So you have to get enough signatures within your constituency to nominate in the first instance. But the second that you qualify to nominate, you will then get an upfront payment, a modest one, but an upfront payment from the state to initially fund your campaign. The second thing that we're doing is that we will continue to allow new entrants, that is non-incumbent candidates who aren't in a political party, so an independent new entrant, we're going to preserve their ability to fundraise up to a maximum of $2,700 per donation. So, but if Rory Stewart's running as an independent in the state seat of, Croydon, my electorate, if you're elected, at that point you're in the system and you can no longer fundraise.
Got you.
Social media, Peter, again, two very simple questions. What is it you're trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? And how are you trying to do it?
I think there's enough peer-reviewed research out there now, Alastair, that makes it clear, social media access for children is actually doing them harm, particularly around mental health. I don't think this is in dispute anymore. We've seen journal after journal publish reports along these lines. The second element is the more fundamental sort of societal question. I think democracy is in difficult shape at the moment. It's probably going through its most challenging period, certainly since World War II. And I think there's a number of things that governments can do to help insulate democracy. We've already spoken about compulsory voting, banning money from politics. But I think social media and disinformation is really dangerous, particularly in the minds of young people who don't yet have the critical faculty to be able to account for misinformation in the way that you hope an adult would. Even adults struggle. So we think the best thing to do is just get social media out of the hands of children. This idea, well, the model that we are pursuing and set to deliver is based on the model that Ron DeSantis has deployed in Florida. And, there's not too many things I probably find myself agreeing with Ron DeSantis on, but I actually thought what he's doing is a good thing. And I don't have any shame in saying that we would like to repeat it.
Peter, tell us how that model works in practice. I've got a 9-year-old son. Tell me a little bit about what would then happen to him and his access to social media.
So we've appointed the former Chief Justice of the Australian High Court to provide advice on the best legal mechanism to do this. We're going to release that report hopefully in September. But put simply, we want to put in place a piece of legislation that creates a burden or an onus or an obligation on social media platforms. They know the age. They have the capacity to know the age of people who have an account. Rory Stewart can't just get a social media account. You have to go through a process. You have to fill out a form and the like. There should be age verification. The obligation should be on the social media platform. And if you're under the age of 14, you should not be allowed to get one. Now that sounds simple, but of course, in practice it's complex, but that's the detail that we're working through. And since we've made our announcement that we're doing this and intend to complete the work this year, most other states and territories have indicated that they're getting on board. We've got a major summit in Australia in a couple of weeks to do that. The federal government and federal opposition are keen to deploy it. So I think this is going to happen. But the only other element is giving. For children between 14 and 16, they would require parental consent. Like I said, the model has been applied in Florida. It seems to be working. We don't see any reason why we can't achieve it here in South Australia and Australia.
Peter, it's very exciting for us. But of course, as you can imagine, we've been interviewing on this podcast people like Nick Clegg, who's a kind of big employee of Facebook, and Hella Thorning-Schmidt and others, and they're very much saying, you haven't read the evidence. There's no evidence that social media is damaging people. There's no evidence it's polarizing. So these big social media companies obviously have a huge interest in trying to block this. Are you hearing from them? What are they saying? How do you mount counterarguments? Or are you brilliantly managing to start a revolution in South Australia that Facebook hasn't really woken up to, and they're going to not notice it until it's swept its way across the world?
Oh, look, I'd love it to be the latter. They've noticed, but they're not engaging with us, and despite our invitations to do so. And that includes with the former Chief Justice of the High Court.
Why do you think that is? I think they're making a big mistake there.
Yeah, me too. We're hopeful that changes. We're hopeful that changes. Because look, when we announced that we're doing this publicly, I made it clear that we'd much rather work with them than without them. Doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to agree, clearly, but they're a legitimate stakeholder in this, and it'd be easier if they were on board and engaged. I don't know if they think they'd rather put their head in the sand or just be dismissive of it or to fight it once they see the legislation. It worries me because I'd like to know what they're thinking.
Yeah.
If I'm honest about it. I know Nick Clegg was also a supporter of electoral donation reform when he was in the coalition government. So anyway, but look, we're doing this. I met with a gentleman by the name of Vivek Murthy, who is the US Surgeon General in the Biden administration and had that position in the Obama administration. It was a real privilege to meet him, an extraordinary human being, exceptionally accomplished and clearly very intelligent. He's issued a nationwide US Surgeon General warning asking parents to get their kids off social media. That is how strongly he believes the evidence is that this is now decidedly doing them harm. And he cited to me an exercise they did in the US, which I thought was really interesting. They asked a bunch of 13-year-olds, are you on social media? And they all said yes. Then they asked them, would you like to give up social media? And they all said no. Hardly surprising. But then they asked them, if you knew that all your friends were giving up social media, would you do it too? And they all said yes. And a significant proportion of those said, well, we would actually prefer that, which is a demonstration of the fact that kids aren't necessarily on social media because they love it, but because they've got no choice but not to. If they choose not to be on social media, they're actively choosing to disengage with their friends. And that's not an option to a young person. We've already banned mobile phones in public schools in South Australia. We're the first state to have a total ban. We've had it in place now for just on 12 months. And all the reports are being resoundingly positive, not just from teachers and principals talking about how loud schoolyards are now, but actually from kids saying they actually prefer it.
What do you define, when you talk about the harm that social media does to young people, how do you define that harm?
So we've seen, it's defined in a number of respects. Firstly, it's demonstrated in the evidence of the rise of diagnoses of mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, and in its most extreme, of course, tragically, in the form of self-harm. All these numbers are going up globally. And there's a bit of research out there that points to the correlation between that and the development of social media platforms on phones with front-facing cameras. That seems to be the moment where things started to change. But, anecdotally, not just anecdotally, but also we know that, bullying has always existed in schools. I think it's naive to suggest otherwise. What changed with social media is, once upon a time, if a kid got bullied at school, they went home and found a place of refuge. There is no refuge in a world of social media. And kids going home and they're looking at their phone and their screens and the bullying continues or exacerbates. It's that permanent sense of being under siege for a young person has a particularly deleterious impact on their upbringing. And you think about how, I'm a politician. I'm a professional politician. You would think that I am trained to read comments on social media and dismiss them and think whatever. And largely I can. But even I, every now and then, read a comment on social media aimed at me and I still feel the pinch. Imagine if you're a 13-year-old kid. It worries me greatly.
Peter, let's just develop this for a second, because we've got actually a pattern now around the world of relatively young, talented politicians leaving politics, particularly women. And part of that, I think, must be this continual abuse.
Undoubtedly.
On social media. Just talk about it a little bit. And, you seem a relatively, as you say, balanced, robust person, but just give listeners a sense of what it can be like for politicians, particularly female politicians, when it's really going wrong, what the emotional impact is, and why it means that sometimes good people feel a bit abused and harassed in public service.
Politicians are, I think politicians often are a demonstration of the best of humankind and the worst. But ultimately we are human. We have all the fragilities and the failings of human beings. But politicians are always looking for feedback. They want to know what their constituents think of the work that they're doing and what they're advocating for, and are they doing a good job? That's, again, that's human. But how do you get that feedback outside of elections? There's published polls, but they tend not to occur at the candidate level. They're normally at the national level. So that doesn't really apply to a local MP in their constituency. So social media becomes a proxy for feedback. But of course, it's a terrible one because the people who are motivated to contribute on social media almost always are particularly strident in their views. It's not a normal thing to sit around and tap out responses to politicians on social media. But politicians gravitate towards that because they are yearning for a sense of how their performance is going and how good a job they're doing for their constituency. So on one level, it's rational that they read comments and social media responses, and then before you know it, you're heading into the rabbit hole of a pretty dark place. Yeah. And I think that infects your view And after a while, it could take a toll on the best person. So I do think it's having an impact. I don't know what the answer to that, because, of course, social media and politics can be a platform for good dialogue and exchange of ideas.
I guess it's not helped when the main platform is owned by somebody who seems to be becoming as big a narcissist and sociopath as Donald Trump. You're a big supporter of AUKUS, the tripartite defence arrangements between Australia, the UK and the US.
I am.
Is that mainly for strategic reasons, your security interests as you see them? Is there also an added kind of huge defence industry element for South Australia?
My advocacy principally is orientated to the first one. Despite there's no denying it's in our state's interests industrially, and the demand it creates for labour and improving our economic complexity. But for the country, this is strategically critical. Look, Australia's defence posture needs to reflect the time that we're living in and the part of the world that we see changing around us. Australia is, in far closer proximity to the UK, to the biggest military build-up that we've seen since World War II. And you've basically got two options. You can either say, look, that's not a problem, nothing we should worry about, and let things run their course, which is a legitimate option, or say, no, that creates an environment that warrants a response. And I'm certainly in the latter category. I think that it is mission critical now more than ever, particularly as we see the politics of isolationism in some parts of the world on the rise, that Australia think about our sovereign capability to have a defence sector and to produce the equipment that we would require to defend ourselves. And the AUKUS arrangement, I think, gives us the most accelerated pathway to move up the value chain in terms of the sort of products that we afford our men and women in uniform. I think this is my view, and this differs from other people's in my party at the membership level, but I think this accords with the best traditions of the Australian Labor Party and how we understand our capacity as a small middle power to be able to have a positive influence in the region.
Just for listeners to explain, at the core of the AUKUS arrangement is Australia constructing next generation high technology nuclear powered submarines. And this was controversial because they initially had a deal with France, which the UK and US supplanted. And a lot of the technology that Peter's talking about or the Premier's talking about, is in relation to developing that engineering capacity and building capacity. Premier, can I just also give you a chance to talk about what it feels like to look at the world from Australia's perspective? Because obviously we in Britain are surrounded by very mature democracies. But you are looking at a world where you're facing directly at an authoritarian China. You're looking at a populist India. You're looking at Prabowo having been elected in Indonesia. You have in Singapore a very effective but relatively authoritarian state. I mean, there's all these very different political models surrounding you in Asia Pacific. What does that teach you about the inevitability of liberal democracy and the direction of the world?
Look, I think for Australians who think about it and have that in their consciousness, it elevates in their minds the fact that we simply cannot take the liberal democracy that has largely served our country exceedingly well for granted. Plain and simple. I suspect my view about this has been informed by my heritage and the circumstances in which my family found themselves in Australia. But I do think there's a rising consciousness in the broader Australian public about the fact that geopolitically we are in a more precarious time in the fastest changing region on the planet. I also think there's a rising awareness that isolationism in America is sort of gathering steam. And while the Australian-US alliance is in a stronger position as ever been in many respects, it's not something you can always assume will be true because policies can change. Now, I don't say that to diminish in any way, shape or form the strength of the relationship at the moment, but it would be reckless on behalf of Australia to assume the status quo will be here forevermore. So there's a legitimacy in wanting to pursue a sovereign capability. And I think more Australians are on board with that now than they may have been if you were trying to prosecute that argument 10 years ago.
One of the things that struck me when I was out in Australia that time that I met you at the festival, and I also met some of your state premier colleagues, Jacinta in Victoria and Chris Minns in New South Wales, was that there is a kind of, I do get a sense of a kind of confidence about Australia at the moment. And the thing I felt whenever the discussion came to AUKUS was that it was basically talking a lot about the A and a lot about the US and not that much about the UK. And I just wondered the extent to which the UK, which has these extraordinary historic links with Australia, is genuinely, as opposed to the kind of sentimental stuff, genuinely how much do we feature in the thinking and the debates that happen around politics in Australia, in a way that when I think we used to have conversations with Paul Keating, I kind of really genuinely felt that we were quite a big part of the kind of Australian political mindset.
I think in my state, there's a real awareness of the UK's role in the AUKUS relationship, because we're going to be building submarines with the UK more than the US. We're taking I've been to Barrow in the UK where you build the submarines, and that there's a lot of attention about what happens in Barrow and Derby with Rolls-Royce and what that will mean for our state. I think that the reason why there's been more noise around the US element of AUKUS is because there have been questions in the public realm and in the media, in the commentariat around whether or not a change of administration in the US to a Trump presidency would compromise AUKUS. Now, I'm actually quite confident it won't and hopeful that it won't. But there's been a lot of discussion around that. I think that's probably the reason why there's been more conscious of this.
I guess my question, Peter, goes more broadly than AUKUS and defence.
Yeah.
If you're an Australian, if you and your colleagues from around Australia were sitting there having a dinner with Anthony Albanese and you sort of say, you just talking about Australia's strategic interests, Rory mentioned, you're always going to have US top of mind. You're always going to have China top of mind. But where do we kind of figure? I'm not asking this out of need. I'm just interested the extent to which I feel we've kind of slipped quite low down the pecking order.
I think that it would be not discussed too broadly up until two things: Ukraine and AUKUS. I think both of those things have completely re-elevated the Australian-UK relationship, not just in a defence context, but in a government-to-government and political one. Oh, the other one I would say is, leaving the Brexit also sort of created a sense that there was an opportunity to have a more direct relationship with the UK than what was the case previously. I'm not saying that that's a considered view. I'm just saying there's certainly been a sense of that, and the pursuit of a free trade agreement with the UK speaks to that.
Last one from me, Premier. I'm looking forward very much to. I'm coming to Australia end of October, beginning of November, and I'm doing. I'm going around speaking, but like Alastair in Perth and Canberra and Sydney and Melbourne, and I'm looking forward to it very much. Give me a sense, though, on what I should be looking for on that visit in terms of how we can build stronger relationships between Australia and the UK, and what might be involved in that, and how those connections work, and whether the monarchy is part of that or not, or what other dimensions apart from defence can bring these countries closer together.
Well, an acknowledgement that we're better at cricket and at the Summer Olympics. Well, I think many of the challenges that we see domestically in the UK are comparable to some of them that we see here in Australia. I look at the NHS and our public health system, and the aspirations are the same, but the challenges are just as acute. And, I think any example where we contemplate how the welfare state can modernise, how public policy or how public service delivery can improve in a modern economy where government's capacity to throw largesse at these services is diminishing. I think anything that speaks to that challenge and a sense of shared hope, but shared knowledge to unlock a pathway forward, I think is powerful and meaningful. There's still far more commonality in terms of public policy ideals and challenges between Australia and the UK and almost any other country. And I think when we think about those in a more human fashion and how we can help each other, I think that still captivates the attention of Australians who are interested in public policy.
Yeah. My final question, Peter, and thanks for all your time, is this, that you're quite often written up as a contender for possible future Labour leadership nationally, federally, which of course would mean Australian Prime Minister, but you keep ruling it out. Is that genuine, or if you sort of, I was thinking this in the context of what you said about Tim Walz. I mean, a few weeks ago he was chugging along, thinking, "Oh well, Joe Biden's going to stand, and I'll carry on being governor of Minnesota." And now suddenly it looks like he might end up as being vice president. If you felt that the Labour Party thought you were the guy, is that not impossible to resist?
My state, we're a comparatively smaller jurisdiction to other states in the country, and but that brings with it a degree of agility to give us the flexibility to do a few things that creates an impact, and maybe even an impact that gets taken up across the rest of the country. And so being a premier of a state has got an enormous amount of a possibility and authority attached to it that means you can do a lot of good unencumbered from other considerations. I've said before, I did have an opportunity to go into federal politics, but I ended up choosing this option in a way that I didn't anticipate I would myself. So I feel as though I've made a decision to dedicate myself to making as big a difference from this privileged position I've got. And it's just not on more than not being on my radar, I don't have any intention to do that. And I feel quite comfortable saying, I'm ruling it out and what have you. And think about how disingenuous it would be, Alastair, for someone in a position such as the one I've got to be thinking about the next job more than the one that I've got now. I'm alive to the fact that, I'm alive to the fact that these jobs are temporary by nature. In politics, you can be here one day and there the next, and down the next. So you got to make every post a winner while you got the chance and running 1,000,000 miles an hour, which is what I'm really enjoying doing at the moment. And we've been able to do a few things that the rest of the country is paying interest in. So, and I don't know any other position that would give me the ability to do that.
Okay, well, I'm taking that as an 85% no. But it's been great. It was lovely to meet you when I was out in Adelaide. It's been.
I really appreciated that. Yeah.
No, it really, really has been great talking to you. And I think our listeners will at the end of that understand why people do talk about you in those terms. Added to the fact is when you left the room that we were meeting in at Adelaide Town Hall, as you left the room, there was a woman there from the Literary Festival who said to me, "Do you know what they call him?" And I said, "What do they call him?" They said, "The hunk."
There we are.
There you go. You've got it all. You've got it all. You've got it all.
Right. Premier, we really, really appreciate it. That was great. And hopefully maybe see you in person in Australia when I'm there end of October.
Where are you? Where are you going?
So I'm traveling around the country, giving tours in different talks in different venues, Sydney Opera House.
He's snubbing South Australia, is basically.
And I will try to make sure I get down to you, and I'll be there with the kids as well. So it would be lovely to try to catch up.
Oh, good man. What time of the year are you here?
End of October, beginning of November.
Perfect. Beautiful. Spring. You'll love it.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, Peter. Peter, listen, lovely to talk to you.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Well, Alastair, thank you. I mean, I really, really like that. To be honest, this is a traditional leading. I was a little bit skeptical. I looked in my diary and I was trying to explain to Shoshana who we were interviewing, and I was like, what's going on here? But I trust you. And actually, that was terrific. I really liked it. I mean, and of course, one of the reasons I really loved it is I felt that unlike somebody who's a kind of working politician right in the middle of British politics, he was somebody who was able to talk like a human being, step back a little bit, be a bit more confident, be a bit more honest about stuff. I was very taken with him. What did you make of him?
Look, I've only ever met him that once and spoken to him a few times since, and I really like the guy. I think he's very impressive. I was very, very struck as well when I was out in Adelaide how much people liked him, including people who weren't necessarily Labour people. And I think the reason why I think it was, quotes, just a state premier. I'm not sure even I would necessarily have said let's have him on the podcast. But I think it is really interesting what he's trying to do in politics with this donation banning. And I think it's interesting as well, the stuff on social media. And I think and by the way, on the banning, you say that he talks, he'll talk with a bit more openness than serving politicians, etc. I suspect that will cause him quite a lot of grief within that debate, because it's a difficult thing that he's trying to do. He's the sort of politician of which we need more, which are people who kind of take tough positions, argue for them, hold out for them, and if they work, they work. If they don't, they don't, and then he'll try and move on to the next thing.
I also think it's without being too romantic about him, I think he's a model of what can work quite well in a modern democracy. I mean, if we think about the kind of things that wind people up about politicians in Britain, obviously, there's a lot of people who are very fed up, understandably, with old Etonians. They're fed up with professional politicians and spads. They're looking for, I think, people who are relatable. And he has a good combination of being, as you say, a kind of good-looking, straightforward guy, but also I like the fact, as I said, that he praises the opposition when it does things he likes. He talks like a normal person. There's no sense of kind of super caution and message points that he's pushing across. He's somebody who you'd imagine is a kind of reassuring CEO of a big company too.
Yeah, but but listen, he's got a lot of politics in him. He knows how to do politics. One of the reasons you've often asked me why do I like Australia so much. One of the reasons is that I do think when you go there, and I think you'll find this as well, is that when you meet the politicians, that they're pretty high quality at various levels. I mentioned the other two that I met was the Chris Minns and Jacinta Allen, and I mean they're really impressive people. That you would feel totally comfortable in the idea that they are serious senior political figures. And there is something really rough and tough about Australian politics, but there's also, I find them he's a very, very thoughtful guy, I think. And what he's doing is, and shall I tell you the favourite part of my favourite part of that interview was when he suddenly dropped in that a book about Clement Attlee had changed the way that he governed.
That was wonderful, wasn't it? And also, just sort of quickly to finish, I was saying, I could see him as somebody who'd be a good CEO of a company, and you said, yeah, but he's more political than you're acknowledging. Tell us a little bit about that. What are the ways in which you maybe me or another listener might miss the fact that he's actually a pretty skillful politician?
He give you one indication of where I felt that. So, for example, he made the point that he campaigned on something that he knew was costing him a bit of support.
Right.
Because he knew that if he won, he would need that, having campaigned for it and fought for it, to allow him then to do it, as he said, from day one. Goes back a little bit to your point about, the Ken Clarke theory that you have about the current Labour government. You've got to upset people sometimes to be able to get things done. And I also think that I have a sense of somebody. I thought there was when we talked about the pushback that he was. No, it's my glasses. The pushback that he got on the stuff that he was saying today about a current issue in Australian politics to do with universities. And there was that little sort of twinkle in his eye that said, yeah, I know I'm going to have a few conversations about this and I'm going to have to manage my way through this. And he said, I'll be seeing Albo at the weekend. And he was I think he's one of those guys who, as he said in the discussion about donations, not a transactional politician, but a relationship politician. He will have good relationship, I suspect, with a very, very big network. And
skillful politician, but also confident enough to be prepared to be frank about the damage that social media does, even on him.
Yeah.
I thought that was nice. I mean, he's not presenting himself as completely invulnerable.
No.
He's convincing because I think he's able to have the confidence to open up a little bit about other sides of things.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. As ever, Rory, I've been proven right about our choice of guests.
As always, Alastair. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.